We were in the last parable of Matthew 25 at the end of August. And then we went back to Matthew 25 at the end of September and did all three parables. And then from there, we went into a four-part study into James. James being the New Testament book of ethical and moral standards for Christians in the New Testament. And we're in week 3 of 4 this week. We were in James chapter 2 talking about faith and works and how what Paul describes in his letter about works of the law doesn't save, only God saves. That's the instructions on how you become a Christian. What James' instructions are is once you become a Christian, here's what you ought to do. And we discussed how what Paul says and what James says aren't in conflict. They're taking different looks and also making assessments about where a person is on their journey with God. And then last week we talked about the two kingdoms from James chapter 3, and that we can either get our wisdom from spiritual wisdom, which comes from above, or from secular wisdom, which really ends up being a little bit more than just knowledge. And now this week we come into James chapter 4, and he spends the opening part of the chapter talking about the good things that we can do with our words and the bad. And then as we get into this section of James, more of direct assessments, and then some of that paraenetic literature that this is written in with a bit of a diatribe in the middle, where James is basically holding two arguments with himself and asking and answering the questions to those. That's where we find us this morning. And I do want to talk about 4 things that I think are very helpful if we're studying these 5 verses. This should be helpful things to know, but also want to focus on our illustrations this morning because Books A Million in Anderson Mall has become my favorite place to buy books off the shelf. And I got a gift card and was able to make some selections off my to-read list. And one of those I've been kind of eyeing for a while was written by a Jesuit priest who became a priest in the early 1930s. He volunteered to go on a Russian assignment at the request of Pope Pius XI with some other men, and they go to Rome for this intense Soviet Union training as the politics of Europe unfold in the 30s. It's decided by the Catholic Church, we're not going into the Soviet Union, we're going to get as far as Poland. And it's about this guy's story as a young priest who is answering the call and feels all these wonderful things inside about the peace and happiness and joy he has in his heart, being able to find his purpose and lean into that and work that. But then the horrors of the situation and also not appreciating that how we can romantically look at future endeavors may not be as romantic as we anticipated, because in his story, as the Russians come in 39 and take over East Poland, and the Nazis have basically stopped at Warsaw, the man's got to make a choice. For the workers they're rounding up and detaining and questioning to be sent back from Poland to the Soviet Union, does he go with them? Because that is his original identity in his call story to ministry. And he goes through some difficult things internally to try and decide, do I stay in Poland? Do I follow these workers in disguise into the Soviet Union? Because if there's one thing that all communism has in common, Communism hates organized religion, and it promotes atheism. So he has experienced a little taste of that in Poland. He's going to get a real big taste of that in the Soviet Union. And what I found so compelling in his story matches up with what James and what Jesus was saying in his parables. Because even in the horrible conditions, he ends up in a Siberian prison for 23 years for being a Vatican spy in the Soviet Union. And that had a lot of difficulties that put on him. But even in saying all of that, when he found himself able to pray, and early on there was another priest who was arrested with him, they could sneak off in the woods and have worship. Between worship and prayer, he was able to fill himself inside with all that he needed in order to do the will of God. And I think he goes through what many of us would go through when he's trying to make this decision, because there's part of him that just says, come back home. Because in a land that promotes atheism, a land that their constitution allows for you to worship any religion you choose, it's illegal to do sermons, it's illegal to proselytize, you're rounded up and questioned frequently, and that has an impact on people who attend. But he has some profound things that he found to be true about himself that I think applies to us as people universally, and then about what enabled him to do and stay with such a difficult assignment. And I got to thinking about his comments on prayer when, thinking back 3 weeks ago at Gilgal, we have 2 or 3 girls for children's church or children's sermon. And I'd asked a question, they had answered it, but for the emphasis, I wanted to ask it a different way. Totally lost them where I was going. So to regroup, I just asked the little one there, about 4 years old, I know you say your prayers before you go to bed at night. When you finish your prayers, how does that make you feel? And she stopped fooling with her coloring sheet, and she looked me in the eyes and said, happy. Well, that's what Walter Kizik, who wrote He Leadeth Me, in the title of our sermon this morning, when he could get away and pray for himself, for others, for the other 2 Catholic priests who decided to risk it and go with him. Prayer brought him comfort and peace and happiness. And I want to say this from his words. He's praying for guidance at this point about whether to stay in Poland, whether to come back home and consider it a failure, or whether to go all in, go into the Soviet Union. So that was my prayer for guidance. And immediately there came flooding back that sense of peace, that feeling of joy, that confidence in the simple and direct faith expressed in trusting him alone. I knew then what I must do. I experienced then what I'd heard from spiritual directors or read in spiritual books, but never fully understood. That God's will can be discerned by the fruits of the Spirit it brings. That peace of soul and joy of heart are 2 such signs, provided they follow upon total commitment and openness to God alone and are not founded on the self's desires. The validity of a call can be tested by the movements of soul that accompany it. That the movements of God's grace must always be accepted and understood in virtue of the life of faith. Because ultimately, the truth of every mysterious action of God's grace is discerned in the light of faith, rather than by the powers of reason or of intellect. In following the parable's instructions in Matthew 25, prepare. And that's what he's done. And then we know from other scripture, pray in all things. And that's what he's doing. And then he's living out the moral and ethical requirements of the book of James by willing to be able to do. And I know this is an extreme example. I don't think any of us need to sell everything we have and move halfway across the country and try to do something maybe we're not equipped to do or called to do. But the point of such a dramatic story is to show with no resources, with conditions that are so wretched and despicable, he still found meaning. He still found purpose. He still had moments of joy. He still had fulfillment and peace in the heart. And it came from prayer and from worship. What we take very seriously here, both prayer and worship, that is what is getting him through the hard times, because he also goes on to say that under the worst imaginable conditions, a man remains a man with free will, and God stands ready to assist him with his grace. Indeed, more than that, God expects him to act in these circumstances as he would have him act. For in these situations, in these people, places, and things, are God's will for him now. It can be so easy for me to say, well, if I had more, or if I had this skill, or if things were different, or if I was in a different season of life, then I would definitely. And I think what's so powerful about a story like Walter's is he was young, naive, inexperienced, gung-ho, all in, but not really prepared for what would be coming at him, and not equipped to handle it. And yet, with God's grace, everything he needed was provided for him to do God's will. And he had written a book before the one he leadeth me, because when he was released from prison in 1963 and came back to the United States, it was a very weird situation for him, because the United States, the Catholic Church, they had all pronounced him dead in the Soviet Union in 1947. So he shows up 16 years later, alive. And what he was saying in that was, in that situation, there was such a demand for his story that he was willing to tell it. But they wanted it told in a certain way. So he did. And this book is him being more open and honest about his journey through that, because he had the same doubts. He even mentioned at one time he almost gave in to despair, and I think we know what that means. But to see a person continue to go back and try to understand God's will, to do it, and to have almost nothing to do it with, and the stakes so high that life in prison could be a result, it should encourage us to at least take some steps forward in our life, to look around more, to evaluate more. Is there something I have as a Christian that would help somebody I see in need? And I think this leads us well into looking closer at our text this morning, because there are some things that James assumes in these last 5 verses of chapter 4. And part of the things that he assumes is that the devotion to God is not confined to just religious acts. It encompasses all acts of life. And that those that he is addressing in his text this morning are not specifically religious. He challenges all the Christians in the faith to trust in God. And when they start to plan in order to do, that God is included in those plans, because right after he goes in verse 13 with this information, he starts asking some of those questions. What is life? he explains it depending on your translation in very Jewish imagery. And James wrote his book from a very Jewish viewpoint. And he explains that life is like a mist or a vapor or a puff of smoke. It comes and it goes. And then in the cleverness of the literature style that James has written, we see some irony in his words, like we saw last week in chapter 3. In chapter 3, he was trying to make a point to a subset of Christians he was writing to that even the demons know who Christ is, and they tremble as a result. Whereas there are Christians that he's writing to, they know who Christ is, and it is what it is. So what he says then in verse 15, he starts with, if the Lord will. So in first century Middle East, if the Lord will is a pagan slogan. So what James is trying to say in the irony is, pagans among you say, if the Lord will, I will do this or that. And if pagans are using that terminology like that, surely Christians will too. And what he's saying as his chapter comes to a close is that in the context of what he is writing in chapter 4, he's specifically he's referring to the refusal to apply faith to all aspects of life. And if we think back to what James is really focusing on, he is focusing on life after we become a Christian. So much of the New Testament is important in other ways because first we need to know who Christ is. What does Christ do? How do I become a Christian? How do I get to heaven? These things are handled in those opening books. But the instructions on what to do with the life as a Christian after is specifically addressed here. And what he is also trying to say is, in the ultimate reality that we all live in, you don't know what tomorrow holds. You don't even have access to it without God's approval. So if you're going to make plans, if you're going to go and do something and change, include your faith in all of that. And as we look next week to conclude our series on James, I hope that we have stacked this information in a way where it seems both logical, it seems both appropriate, and it seems like something we can all start on today. And basically, going back to the parables, plan. Don't be lazy. Do or don't do. If you decide to do, let's get into James and see what those instructions are. And then when we put on the literary style that he's writing in, understand that he jumps around from topic to topic. And 5 verses may be about one subject, and then the next 7 totally unrelated. But he's able to give us, in 108 verses, over 60 things we are to do. It's a very unique way of writing in a very concise manner. But we have to sometimes go slowly through it so that we don't overlook what it may have meant in a first century environment. So as we look to James and reflect on Matthew 25, let this sermon be a sermon of encouragement to you. These are not things that I'm saying you're not doing that you should. I see this taking place all around you with all of you. You plan, you pray, you worship, and you do. My encouragement this morning is take it to the next step. What are the things at your disposal that are unique to you that you can improve somebody's suffering condition just through kindness or some other act of love? Because if we want the world to be different than what it is today, We're going to have to follow Fred Rogers' advice, but modify it for a little bit. When the world is scary and frightening and confusing and broken, he says, look for the helpers. There's always helpers. But I think we're at a point in the world where we need to be those helpers. People need to be able to look to us to say, in this chaos, in this trying time, in this state of global confusion, I know folks at Shiloh who are making a difference. And it's transforming their lives. And it's transforming the lives of the community around them. Because we have been so transformed through the love and mercy of Christ. I think that's what compels us to share it with others. Because he gave so much for all. And we've done so much and benefited from all the blessings he's given us. We need to share it with others. And that's the good news this morning.